So jumping into the other half of our software is a good way of saying it is the designer. So any of these graphics that you decide to bring in from the graphics library can be customized by simply right-clicking on them and hitting edit or hitting edit while in the preview window. However, if you want to create a new one, you can simply go ahead and access new and then create a new graphic, and it'll pretty much sub in a little template here that I can then remove those fields or build off of that little template. But let's go ahead and inspect something that we've already had in our playlist here and edit it. So we can go ahead, right-click, edit. Now we have access to the actual design itself. So this is what we refer to as the designer, which is a window, a separate window on its own, which allows us to design the graphics that we will use for our production. Here, if you've used anything like After Effects or Photoshop, if you have a certain workspace enabled, or Premiere, where we have a timeline that pretty much determines the runtime for that particular graphic. So we can see the end and start of that graphic, which is pretty much your play in and then whole play out. We have all of our design elements within, or our design layers for that graphic, separated as individual layers, along with their existence being determined by the length of their little bar here, denoting how long that element will persist along the timeline. Then another thing that we have additionally is this pause point. So this pause point determines where it is that the graphic will pause when we play it in from Tabular Live's playout interface. So for example, if I customize this pause point to happen before these design layers come in and appear, let's say, for example, this is our new pause point. We can confirm these changes by clicking on the green check mark. Then we will get a quick re-render for those updates. Then we will see that the graphic will pause before any text elements appear because I have assigned that to be the pause point. So a good way of understanding that is pretty much everything before the pause point is our animate in. Everything after our pause point is our animate out. This allows us to pretty much remove any static duration on certain things. Since we can customize the duration of a graphic as to how long it stays on screen in our playout interface, we can customize things like delay. We don't have to then offset that with actual playtime on a specific graphic. Because one thing that I've seen in the past, and one thing from my own experience, is, let's say, for example, you have an export that's a video layer. That's your graphic from like After Effects. And you need that particular lower third piece to delay for about like 5 seconds or 10 seconds. That delay gets incorporated into the actual design itself so that you can actually get that delay that's desired. You can then an actual Tabular Live, which is more efficient for the sake of performance, overhead, and just more customization flexibility for how that's treated during playout. You can offset that static duration to pretty much be one frame and then customize it from your playout interface. So there's a lot that you can do, and that's referencing back to the flexibility of graphics and just the level of customization that you have from within the designer and from the playout interface, and just the level of interplay that you have and the access that you have in terms of using different data controllers or just things being driven manually to have those graphics play out the way that you require them down to the accurate second or even frame. Other things that we can see from the designer interface is just like we saw in the live data preview or even multi-entry, if it was enabled as an update while live, is we can see a breakdown of all the variables that have been enabled on this particular graphic itself. We have our 2 name fields and then 4 different texture color fields. So if we click on any of these design layers from within the designer itself or on the actual canvas, we have the freedom to click from either the timeline area or the canvas. We can see here that clicking on this piece of text, we have different styling attributes. So if we needed to change the font or if we needed to change the color of that text element, we can then do that from here, convert it to a gradient or to be an image video texture if we wanted to, add additional styling. So if we wanted that particular text element to have an outline, it now has an outline. This will behave as a separate style element. So if you wanted to customize something, and if you look at our cinema collection, if you're familiar with it from our post library or even some of the collections that we've delivered in the past, that's pretty much the style elements. It's what allows us to pretty much mock up a wide variety of different graphic design trends, because there's a lot of options in terms of gradients, texturing, overlapping some of these style elements so that you can get a more sophisticated look, and also the access to 3D controls, which allows us to bevel, extrude, and even if we wanted to rotate things in 3D space. Like I was mentioning, there's a variety of things that you can do with your different design layers to pretty much accomplish the stylistic goal and logic of, and in terms of animation, and if you desire to build out the graphics that you wish to have for your production. But one thing that we can see here is that, let's say, for example, this particular image square here, we can see that under the style settings in the style tab, it's enabled as a variable. This will pretty much allow it to be enabled as a texture variable, image variable, and we can see in this dropdown, we can name that if we wanted to, whatever we want. So we can name it to city image if we desire. That will change its variable name and will be then reflected in the playout interface as well. So we can then see city image is the variable name for this particular element. If we wanted to swap that out, we can also do that from the designer interface like we can from the live or for the playout interface. Other things like gradient and textures also have the same setting where if you want to enable something as a color variable, simply going to the 3D face for that corresponding color, enabling it as a variable, and then either using the pre-populated text here or using a custom name, color white, for example, we can then see that this variable appears in our global tab as color white. And then if we wanted to, we can break its rules and then make it red. Another thing that we can also do is that, let's say, for example, we wanted to customize or enable a text variable. Under the motion and data tab, when selected on a text design layer, we can simply go to motion and data, scroll all the way to the bottom, and we see variable settings category. From here, we can then enable the text variable or disable it if it has been enabled. Then we can use a drop down to use some of these default names that we have here or make your own. So we can then name this to subheader if that's our naming convention for a particular production. Check our global tab and then see that subheader is now the new name of that particular field. If we need to add our own or additional text elements, we can add something as static text, which will make it so that that text element is disabled by default as a variable. So it won't be a variable, it will simply just be a text flourish is a good way of saying it. So you can see here, this one did not populate onto my global tab and is not enabled as a variable under my variable category. But if I add a variable text, we can see this one automatically gets checkmarked as a variable and gets auto-assigned a name. But we can also then customize this to be a variable name. In reference global tab, we can then see this one is now name. One thing that's interesting to note is that I currently have two things that are named name now. I have what used to be, or what currently is watch previous seminars and enter text to be name. But since they share a variable name, we can then customize that text so that they both show the same value. So if you have variable names that are matching across various texts or various textures that are the same image name or image variable name, or different colors, or different pieces of your graphic that you want to be the same color but are different components, you can name those the same color variable name, and then that applied change will be then globally applied across those specific elements. When it comes to adding shapes, you have the option of adding ellipses, rectangles, or stars. Do note that both text, ellipses, rectangles, and stars are all vectors within the software, so I can resize these however I want, and the edges of these shapes won't be compromised in terms of quality like aliasing and whatnot, or pixelation. This also brings in another interesting thing, is that you can also import your own vectors. So you can see a variety of different things that I can directly import into this particular design. I see images, videos, image sequences, vectors, which have to be in EPS format, and Photoshop files. So if you have a Photoshop file that you've already worked on, if you have a design package that was delivered to you, or if you have designers that exclusively are familiar with Photoshop, you can pretty much import Photoshop files and then use those as your graphic and use the pause point from the designer to then play those out. And quickly going over one last thing that I think is critical for understanding the designer is that with these particular graphics from the library, they will already come with animations. But if you want to add your own, you can see for this particular one of accent, this design layer named accent, I can drop down this little arrow and we can see the animation for the fade in. That's our animate in and out. But if I wanted to animate, for example, this ellipse, I can simply click on it, navigate to the transitions tab. This will automatically, if my library is open, organize a little folder area in our library that shows us all of our transitions or animations that are transitions. We can see here a couple of different collections of animations. Here's some fade-ins, some fly-ins, some pop-ups, some overlays. We can use this infinity one if we desire, and then we get presets of this particular set. So we can quickly mouse over to get a preview of how that's being applied to our design layer. If we wanted to, let's say, for example, preview this over a piece of text, we can then look at infinity and see how it is that it treats text. We can see that there's a leaping letters one. So we can also customize if an animation applies to a piece of text letter by letter, word by word, or line by line. Different, let's say, for example, we want to apply this particular transition. We simply drag it to this transitions area or directly onto the layer at the beginning to make it an animate in, or at the end to make it an animate out. Then we can customize the duration of that transition within the layer by sliding or squishing down that little layer to determine its duration. We can see how much we trimmed it by frames with the little pop-up there. And then every single transition collection or preset is going to have its own custom parameters depending on the behavior that that transition consists of. Since this one uses an angle for the vaulting animation, and we can also do fade-ins, we can then see that by making a 100% fade and then vaulting up from the right corner, changes that to then vault it from the right and fade in. We can then apply that to paragraphs, so we can see that apply to all the letters. So a lot of things that you can do, and it will take some time to become familiar with all the things that ship with our library in terms of animations, effects, and whatnot. But I mean, it does get you pretty far in terms of creating graphics. Just as an example, every single graphic from the graphics library was created with the things and tools provided within the designer. So that is, if relief, some semblance of confidence as to your ability to build whatever you want from here.